Welcome to Beyond the Powerline Road, a podcast dedicated to bringing inspirational stories to you. This week, I want to bring you a story about King Solomon. And it's not just about King Solomon, but it's about how we should act and behave. And so I'm going to go to 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 1. I'm going to read chapter 9, verse 1 and 2, and then I'm going to skip down and read a few more verses on 2 Chronicles chapter 9, then we'll go to Kings and a few other verses. 2 Chronicles chapter 9. Now when the queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon, she came to Jerusalem to test him with hard questions, having a very great retinue and camels bearing spices, and very much gold and precious stones. And when she came to Solomon, she told him all that was on her mind, and Solomon answered all of her questions. There was nothing hidden from Solomon that he could not explain to her. And of course, this is the wisdom of Solomon, and we continue on in verse 22, seeing it again. Thus King Solomon excelled in all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. And all the kings of the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his head. Every one of them brought his presents, articles of silver and gold and garments and mirth and spices and horses and mules, so much year by year. And Solomon had 4,000 stalls of horses and chariots, 12,000 horsemen, who he stationed in chariot cities with the king of Jerusalem. And he ruled over all the kings from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines to the borders of Egypt. The king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of Shephelah. The horses were imported for Solomon from Egypt and from all lands. Now the rest of the acts of Solomon, from first to last, are they not written in the history of Nathan the prophet, and in the prophecy of Ajalah the Solomite, and in the visions of Iddo the Seer concerning Jeroboam the son of Nebat? Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel for 40 years. There are so many history books missing from the Old Testament era. Iddo the Seer wrote at least 2 history books, and he is mentioned a number of times in different verses. And I would absolutely love to read what he said about Solomon, because sometimes I think that he might have given us a clearer vision of what we think about Solomon. If we go to Ecclesiastes, we can even see what Solomon thinks sometimes. In Ecclesiastes, verse 12, 13, Solomon says, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil." And we know this. We know that Solomon made this statement, and we probably know this as a memory verse. For this is the whole duty of man, to fear God and to keep his commandments. History, though, sometimes is made a little bit nicer and not as clear as time goes on. And this is kind of why I wanted to see the books of Iddo the Seer, which are missing in history. If we think about Chronicles that we read, Chronicles was written a good 400 years after King Solomon died. King Solomon died in 930 BC, and First Chronicles was written right around 455 BC. But if we wind up looking at some of the other information in the Old Testament, like First Kings, which is a little closer to Solomon's death, we see a few other events in Solomon's life that is not recorded in Chronicles. And we can see this very often in our study of history. It seems like history is kind to people after a fair amount of time. And I can think of history being kind to, say, Jimmy Carter, for example. Jimmy Carter was, is still alive at this date, and he is perceived as being, a peanut farmer that wound up going and helping Habitat for Humanity and became a carpenter and has done so much carpentry work. And he's done a wonderful job of helping people, I'll grant you that. But I remember when he was president. I remember him mandating 55 miles an hour on the roads. I remember the fuel gas lines. I remember the ridiculous interest rates. I remember him boycotting the Russians, which on grain, which hurt the American farmers. I remember him boycotting the Olympics, which hurt the American athletes. Jimmy Carter did a lot to hurt America. But over a period of 40 years, we start thinking of him more kindly. I think 40 years from now, there will be people that will think more kindly of the president we have in office now. Because after a period of time, we start thinking of individuals a little bit more kindly. So with King Solomon, when we look at Chronicles, over a period of years, the writer of Chronicles looked at King Solomon pretty kindly. But if we look at the timeline of Solomon's life, we see that Solomon in 970 takes the throne. He learns to love the Lord. He asks God for wisdom. God makes him prosper so very much. In 966, he begins construction on the temple, and he instructs his people in God's commandments. The Queen of Sheba visits. Solomon makes a throne of ivory. Solomon is the richest man in the world. And in 959, the temple is complete. So Solomon did wonderful things. Absolutely wonderful things. And then he gets to be about 50 years old. And it says, his love for foreign women turns Solomon's faith from God. And as a result, God punishes Solomon and sends him enemies. Tells him that the kingdom will be torn apart. Solomon tries to kill Jeroboam, and in 935, Solomon writes the book of Ecclesiastes. In 931 or 930, depending upon where you're looking at history, Solomon dies of natural causes at a fairly young age of 60 years old. So when we think of King Solomon, we think of a man of wisdom. But when we start looking at King Solomon, we see someone that definitely got into depravity in his life. If you go to look at Kings or even in Chronicles, Solomon was so very rich that silver wasn't considered anything. It was considered worthless. It was considered as other stones. But 1 Kings chapter 11 of 1 Kings was written closer to Solomon's death than Chronicles. Remember, Chronicles, there was 400 years to be a little bit kinder to the history associated with Solomon. So 1 Kings chapter 11. Now King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughters of Pharaoh. Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonites, Hittites, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the people of Israel, you shall not enter into marriage with them, neither shall they you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clung to these loves. He had 700 wives who were princesses, 300 concubines. And in the Bible, in verse 3, it says, and his wives turned away his heart. For when Solomon was old, his wives turned away his heart from after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. And so he's 50 years old, getting on to be 55 years old, and he's turning away his heart from God. Now, he still understands that God is the individual, or God is the God that gave him wisdom, because Solomon would not have written that in Ecclesiastes about fear God and keep his commandments if he didn't maintain some of his wisdom. But again, in 1 Kings, we're continuing on with verse 5. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Now, Ashtoreth, also called Asherah, and Anath, the alleged sister of Ashtoreth, were consorts with Baal and share the same dual characters of goddess of love and war. Ashtoreth was considered a fierce warrior god and the goddess of sexual love and fertility. And we will find more information about that pretty soon. Milcom, also referred to as Molech, was a god where the followers sacrificed children. King Solomon, because of his love for his wives, built temples and groves and high grounds for these two fake gods, one of whom the followers would sacrifice children. Continuing in 6, so Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not wholly follow the Lord as David his father has done. Verse 7. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountains east of Jerusalem. And so he did it for all of his foreign wives who made offerings and sacrifices to their God. Those sacrifices included children. Think about that. Chemosh was the national god of the Moabites, and Solomon built a sanctuary to Chemosh on the Mount of Olives. This movement by Solomon made the worship of Chemosh a part of the religious life of Israel for nearly 400 years. He introduced four false gods. He introduced gods that sacrifices were necessary to properly worship them. And for nearly 400 years, until Josiah came up and started cleaning up Solomon's mess, people were worshiping these false gods. And where does it say about Josiah cleaning up his mess? 2 Kings 23. And so 2 Kings chapter 23, it says, and the king commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, and the priests of the second order, and the keepers of the threshold, to bring out of the temple of the Lord all the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for all the host of heaven. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and carried their ashes to Bethel. And he deposed the priest, whom the kings of Judah had ordained to make offerings to the high places in the cities of Judah and around Jerusalem. Those also who burned incense to Baal, to the sun, to the moon, to the constellations, all the hosts of heaven, he deposed. And he brought out the Asherah from the house of the Lord outside Jerusalem to the brook Kidron, and burned it at the brook Kidron, and beat it to dust, and cast the dust of it upon the graves of the common people. And he broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes who were in the house of the Lord. They were in the temple. And he took the women wool hangings of Asherah. So Josiah cleaned up the mess, and it took him a lot longer to just clean up that mess. He had to go and continue on cleaning up the mess. And then we go to verse 10, and it says, and he defiled Tophethah, which is the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no one might burn his son or daughter as an offering to Molech. So for 400 years, people were offering their babies as sacrifices. They would burn the child as a sacrifice to Molech. And the king defiled the high places that are east of Jerusalem. This is verse 13. To the south of the Mount of Corruption. Guess what? The Mount of Olives in 400 years were called the Mount of Corruption because of Solomon putting these high places and these temples of worship, if you will, for these false gods. And I will continue on, and I'm going to reread 13. And the king defiled the high places that were in the east of Jerusalem to the south of the Mount of Corruption, which Solomon, the king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Sidonians, and for Chemto, the abomination of Moab, and for Milcom, the abomination of the Amorites. So it took Josiah 400 years later to clean up Solomon's mess. And even if we go to Nehemiah and we read Nehemiah, Nehemiah was one of the very last books written in the Bible. Books written in the Old Testament, one of the last ones. He is written around 430. And Nehemiah, towards the end of chapter 13, verse 23, he was getting after the individuals for marrying into other cultures because the cultures believed in false gods. And in verse 26 he goes, "Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there were no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God gave him king over Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin." So, ladies and gents, what do we have to do? Because of the fact that here is a king of Israel that was placed there as a son of David, a individual that knew God, an individual that knew the benefits of knowing God. He was given wisdom, he was given treasures, he was given property. He has benefited so much, and yet he turned from God because he had individuals around him, in his particular case, wives, that believed in something else, and he was foolish enough not to watch over himself and to become part of the sin instead of part of the solution. So if we go to Hebrews chapter 3, and I'm going to read a few verses of something that we need to kind of pay attention of because it can happen to anyone. "Beware, brethren, lest there be any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. Exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin." We need to exhort one another daily. We need to daily pay attention to our brothers and sisters and care for them, because all it takes is a few days or a few short months of things going the wrong way in our life, and it may be hard to get back to God. If we look at Luke chapter 9, verse 23, "And he says to them all, if any desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." Jesus said to take up our cross daily. Acts chapter 17:11. "These are more fair-minded than those of the Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so." And 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16, "Therefore, we do not lose heart, even though our outward man is perishing, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day." As we get older, as we wind up getting older and getting slower and getting more feeble, and our skin cuts easier and everything else, we need to know that the physical human being, the physical person, is perishing. Sure, indeed, we are slowly dying. But that inward man, that soul, needs to be renewed day by day. And if that is the case, we are blessed of all people. So I'm going to go back to Iddo the Seer. Okay, Iddo the Seer, we have lost all of his books and his manuscripts. So I'm going to make an extrapolation. What would Iddo the Seer have told us about King Solomon, about the times that he lived? Because Iddo the Seer was a prophet. And I think he would say, We don't leave this world alive, and we will be judged. And our actions should not cause 400 years of sin, nor for that matter 4 years, or even for that matter 4 days. Our actions should be very limited when it comes to negative things. We need to be positive, loving, caring, daily buffeting ourselves. Searching the scripture daily helps. And even the strongest, like King Solomon, need to be diligent. Ladies and gents, I wish you a wonderful day. And again, search the scriptures daily. They will give you the guidance you need.